Appreciate you joining us today. It is May 2nd. We are finishing up 2 Samuel today. So let's get over there. Let's take a peek at it. 2 Samuel chapter 24. And our reading today is actually this last chapter of 2 Samuel and in 1 Chronicles chapters 21 and 22. So to just look at it, you see what this is, David's census. And the Lord is not going to be pleased. So the anger of the Lord was aroused against Israel. He moved David against them to say, "Go number Israel and Judah." Chronicles adds another little tidbit. We'll read it here in a second. So the king says to Joab, "Go number the people." And Joab effectively says, "Why? Why are we doing this?" But the king's word prevailed against Joab, verse 4. And so they go out and they start counting. And they come back, and Joab gives the sum of the number of the people to the king. There were 800,000 valiant men who drew the sword in Israel. Men of Judah were 500,000 men. And then you have the Lord's judgment. This is the account where the Lord has Gad, David's prophet. One of the prophets come to David, and David's heart condemns him, verse 10. And that's, Chronicles also clues us in as to why. David says, "I have sinned." He prays for forgiveness. The Lord reveals through the prophet, you got three choices. 7 years of famine, 3 months fleeing before your enemies, or 3 days plague. Take your pick. And this is where David says, better to fall into the hands of the Lord than into the hands of men. And the Lord sends a plague upon Israel, and 70,000 men of the people died. Then David, it's the account where David builds the altar. And this altar on the threshing floor of Araunah, the Jebusite, the account where the fellow says, "I'll give it to you," and David says, "Nope. I will surely buy it for you for a price." And that's what ended up happening. David builds an altar there. That is actually, we'll come back to that. I'll mention it, perhaps, if I remember at the end. Okay, 1 Chronicles chapter 21 parallels it. Verse 1, this is one of the clues. Now Satan stood up against Israel and moved David to number Israel. So that kind of gives you Satan's operating behind the scenes. So David says to Joab, and then you have the account of the census. And this also adds a little tidbit. Joab did not count Levi and Benjamin because the king's word was abominable to Joab. Joab didn't want to do it. God was displeased, so he strikes Israel. And the rest of it pretty much parallels it. I'm just trying to make sure that Chronicles doesn't add anything that you don't see in Samuel. I believe that little tidbit there at the end, I don't think that's in Samuel, but I could be wrong. But then we get into chapter 22. You might notice there at the top, then David said, "This is the house of the Lord God. This is the altar of the burnt offering for Israel." Because here, as we think about it, where this is on the threshing floor, at this specific place where David is going to build this altar, this is going to be the exact place where the temple is going to be built. And I don't think it's a coincidence. This is Moriah. Moriah was the place where Abraham came to offer Isaac. In this place, it looks like. I don't think that's a coincidence. So as David has the unlawful census, and as the plague had broken out, and as David makes sacrifice, and God accepts the sacrifice, then we turn to 1 Chronicles 22. So David commanded to gather the foreigners who are in the land of Israel, and he appointed masons, cut hewn stones. And you might notice verse 1, this is the house of the Lord God. He's preparing, verse 3 and on, he's preparing for the temple. He calls his son, verse 5, David says, Solomon, my son, is young and inexperienced, and the house to be built for the Lord must be exceedingly magnificent. So he made abundant preparations before his death. He calls for Solomon, and he charges him to build a house for the Lord God of Israel. And David says to Solomon, It was in my mind to build a house in the name of the Lord my God. But the word of the Lord came to me, saying, You have shed much blood and have made great wars. You shall not build a house for my name, because you have shed much blood on the earth in my sight. Behold, a son shall be born to you, who shall be a man of rest, and I will give him rest from all his enemies all around. His name shall be Solomon, for I will give peace and quietness to Israel in his days. He shall build a house for my name, and he shall be my son, and I will be his father. And I will establish the throne of his kingdom over Israel forever. And that's what was going to happen. Okay. To think about the account in the reading today. David's unlawful census. Why was it so unlawful? Just a few simple points today. One is, God had not commanded it. It is just that simple. There were times where God did command a census to be taken. This is not one of those times. And David says to Joab, Go number them. And Joab says, Why are we doing this? You're bringing a curse on the people. And David says, No, it'll be all right. Go number them. God had not commanded it. People have to learn to respect the authority of God. And the way authority works is God commands, or God does not command. We respect the silence. This is one of the examples where you can show silence does not equal permission. God had not commanded it, and therefore it was wrong to do it. So when people come along and they say, well, where does it say not to? That's not how this works. God has not said to do it, so you don't do it. But David did it. Now, you can tell in the reading, it's tempting to think, well, he's taking a census of all the people, but that it doesn't look like that's the case, because Joab comes back and he numbers those hundreds of thousands in Israel and in Judah, but it's only those who draw the sword. It doesn't look like he's counting everybody. It looks like he's counting the army. It looks like he's counting the soldiers. Now, why would someone, as you think about it, and there's different points to be made, one is you're trusting in the size of your army. That's what it looks like David's doing, and that's why I wanted to read, and I'm glad the reading today included that chapter 22. David, there at the tail end, David had shed much blood. Well, he had shed much blood with what? With his army. This is who David is. And as you think about it, and I'm just, there is a contrast between David, the man after God's own heart, and David's son, Solomon. There's a contrast there. They are not one and the same. David shed much blood. Solomon was going to be a man of peace. And to just think about, again, David trusting in the size of his army. Why would you count the army? I think if you are of a mindset to count the army, it probably shows what do you do with an army? You shed more blood. What do you do with an army? You go on the warpath. And David had constantly been on the warpath. God had told him the sword was never going to leave his house. And that was the prophecy that was made, and that was David's life. He had shed much blood. And God, the question is, was God pleased with that? And it's easy to say, well, God told him to do these things, and yes, that's true. But you can tell in that verse in 1 Chronicles 22, it's the reason that God says, no, you're not going to build the house. Your son's going to. Why? Because you've shed a lot of blood. The man after God's own heart. But his son, the man of peace, Solomon, was going to have rest. And we are going to move. And I was wondering about different points we could make. We are going to move from destruction to building. We're going to move from war to peace. We're going to move from what's the verse? What's the verse in the Old Testament? Beat their the verse about can't get it out of my, won't come out right now. Pruning hooks, plowshares, that passage. Look it up. And you see that transition. The transition from war to peace. Well, that's in a way, that is what's happening here. In a way. We're going to go from bloodshed to building. And now David is going to have to switch gears. And now it's time to prepare. It's like, no, you're not going to build it, but you are going to set your son up for success. And that's what David does. Supplies are going to be at the ready so that Solomon can hit the ground running. And that's what's going to happen. We're going from bloodshed to building. And now it's going to be time to build the temple. The house of God. And I thought it was interesting that David speaks in the present tense, it looks like, when he makes sacrifice there and he says, this is the house of God. There it is. As he turns from his sins. You know, he has that census, and it's like, man, that census doesn't mean anything to God. Because all of a sudden, 70 or 75,000 people are gone just about like that. And it's like, well, I guess it's time to reduce your numbers. Just lowered that census a little bit, didn't he? In the space of a few days as the plague broke out. And that's the danger. It's like, respect the Lord's authority. Don't trust in your own might. And there may be a time to tear down, but now it's time to build. Or it's getting time to build. So get ready for it. Because here comes Solomon. So we'll go and close out there. Appreciate you following along. I hope this study's been helpful for you as we've considered these things, hopefully together. Appreciate you. Hope you join us for our next study.